moderate this August panel discussion. As you know, our topic today is ethical dilemmas in workplace and countering strategies, and we have a very strong panel here. So the format of the discussion will be that we will have a few minutes to talk about the different aspects of ethical dilemmas and ethical situations, and then we will have a series of questions. We will try to make it as interactive as possible. So as I believe you are being shown on the screen here, the login for the Slido app, and you search for #GED 2019. And to make it interactive, actually, you can post all your questions to the panel through this app. And I think we will spend a lot of time on the Q&A to maximize the interaction and the participation of the audience. So unethical, but completely legal. And one of the famous ethics writers, Mary Guy, defines ethics very beautifully and very smartly as that behavior which is the right thing to do given the circumstances. So please focus on this, given the circumstances, the right thing to do given the circumstances, which basically means that a particular set of behavior in a different context may be perfectly ethical, but in a different situation it may be unethical. And that is actually the gray area of the ethics. The chief guest, Dr. Inayat, also mentioned about it's not always black and white, there are shades of gray, and that is where an important decision has to be made, how do we remain ethical all the time. Ethical behavior involves 4 key principles: honesty, integrity, fairness, and concerns for others. And you have to take care of all the 4 factors. For example, it is not enough to be a person who is honest, shows integrity, and is fair in the treatment of others, but lacks the concern for the employees. One of the biggest challenges in terms of ethics at the workplace that we face is to keep a balance among 5 forces. And I'm not referring to the Porter analysis. I'm talking about the 5 forces that we deal with the workplace. And these are the employer or the shareholder, your employees or colleagues, your customers, suppliers, and competition. One needs to keep a delicate balance in managing the affairs with all 5 stakeholders in the equation to ensure there is no unethical behavior. The philosopher, businessman Nicholas Taleb has argued that there are some topics about which experts are more knowledgeable about than non-experts. And he cites the example of brain surgery, astrophysics, etc. And there are topics about which experts have little advantage over non-experts. And those areas are religion, politics, and ethics. So agreement on standards of ethical behavior is certainly inherently very, very difficult. Talking about ethics in the workplace, the first question that comes to mind is it possible to do something about employee integrity? And my thought on that is that one cannot do much about a person's personal integrity, but organizations can certainly do something about their employees' ethical or unethical behavior. All psychologists will confirm that behavior can indeed be changed or modified. So if ethics is about behavior and behavior can be changed, then certainly ethics can be managed. The real game is in the management of ethics is about taking an approach to promote ethical behavior and avoid unethical behavior. With this background, I would request now Aleem Saab, first of all, to share his views on a particular aspect of ethical dilemmas at the workplace in the context of Pakistan.
Aslam alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Shoaib sir. Actually, it is not so complicated as it may sound. It's basically a culture. I think we don't have to go into the definition and all those which the speakers before us has already mentioned. It's the practice which really makes a difference. And certainly there is so much pressure on the job that you do, a lot of people, first of all, you have to have a system in an organization to make sure that people do understand what are the do's and don'ts of this company, of this organization. Secondly, how do you inculcate that culture into the organization. People come and go. I mean, the new people come, the middle management, the senior management. Certainly it's the responsibility of the senior management, but the middle management cannot absorb themselves of the responsibility. But it doesn't come in one day. It has to be sustained on a long-term basis. People do know and have to be reminded that what is acceptable in our culture and what is not. The reason is that I think thousands of years of your hard work, which creates the reputation of an organization, if you do care about your reputation, can be destroyed in one or two incidents that take place. And the examples are many. Volkswagen, for example, incident that you all know, Arthur Anderson incident, many Enron and all those. And mind you, there are such incidents in Pakistan as well, although they don't come on the surface. But there are cases where people, and there are organizations which are very well respected, and there are organizations which in the same category, but they have a different perception in the mind of the people. Why? Because time and again, the people have demonstrated in good organizations that they mean business. So at this stage, I would stop here before move on.
Okay. Can we request Ehsan Sahab to talk about ethics beyond organization, beyond your own organization?
Bilkul. So, Assalamu alaikum. I mean, without adding into the definition or to the definitions that have already been provided on ethics, what I wanted to say, and taking or leveraging on the point that Aleem Sahab very rightly made about culture, I think it may just be a pure coincidence, or perhaps not a pure coincidence, that two people from Unilever happen to be on the stage today. So that I think confirms one of the points that Aleem Sahab made, that there are organizations that build that culture and become known for adopting what I would like to call responsible practices. My definition of ethics is very simple. It is about very much about responsible practices, responsible behaviors, right? My dilemma, or not so much a dilemma, but the challenge arises from how do you define the workplace. The easiest thing to do is to define the workplace as your own organization. And I would think that we will be preaching to the converted. I think most of you adopt very ethical practices within the organizations that you come from, and there's perhaps very little room for improvement. But I think the challenges arise when you widen the definition of the workplace, because in my opinion, workplace does not stop within the boundaries of your office or your factory. It actually extends throughout your value chain. And it was in recognition of that the Pakistan Business Council decided 3 years ago to set up what we call the Center of Excellence in Responsible Business. Because responsible business is about taking the ethical standards that you dearly value within the organization and trying to make sure that your suppliers and your customers and the wider community that you interact with also adopt these. So I want to just give you very simple examples. I'm sure most of your organizations value people. Yeah. So you have definitions of how do you employ people, how do you secure the employment, how do you look after them, how do you promote them, develop them, etc., etc. But how many stop at that and don't care two hoots about what the contractors that you use to provide certain services to your organization do? Yeah. So in my humble opinion, responsible practice is not the workplace within your own boundaries. It goes well beyond. The same applies to paying taxes. All of you pay taxes. You're very liberal, not liberal, but you pay taxes on when they're due. But how many of you ensure that your customers pay taxes, your suppliers pay taxes? All of you look after the environment very responsibly. But then again, in Pakistan, we keep our own home very tidy, but we don't care two hoots about what happens outside on the street. So the same applies into your value chains. And I could go on. Inclusive, growth is something we dearly value. We try and promote more women into our own organizations, but how many of us ensure that our suppliers do it and our customers do that? And of course, we all believe in developing communities, yeah? But what is the definition of the community? The widest definition of the community is the country that we live in, Pakistan. And what is Pakistan facing today? Where are the two key pressure points that are coming on Pakistan's economy? They are in the fiscal domain. So of course we pay taxes, but perhaps we could do more to ensure that our customers and suppliers do that. But also our external account is challenged. How many of us are content in making money and saying, well, we've actually done our task, but we have no responsibility to export more because that's not within our ambit of operation, or certainly we're not going to do anything to create import substitution. So a lot of the growth in the kind of business that I work for comes from imported oil. So what can we do in order to create that import substitution? And if we are doing so well in Pakistan, we've got the scale and the size, and we are serving a population of over 200 million people. We've therefore got some unit cost advantages. Why can't we leverage them to export more within our own value chains across the world? So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Naved, your perspective?
Yeah, so, Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, as Ehsan mentioned, that with organizations like ours who are aiming to develop this culture and inculcate it not only within our organization but also beyond our organization into the organization that we have influence in, it is important that the culture itself in terms of an ethical culture makes a real difference. Especially when it comes from big organizations which have scale like us, because when we become ethical, we can force our partners and suppliers to do the same. While I was researching on the topic, I came across an interesting kind of piece which I'd like to share. It's a story actually, and a lot of people you would have heard about the, if not. There's a research which was conducted in Stanford, which was by a psychologist called Zimbardo. The research's name was Stanford Prison Experiment. And the idea of that experiment was that he created a cell in the basement of Stanford University, and he hired certain people to play roles of guards and prisoners, and they were paid. And they were totally an experimental kind of piece, and the guards were told to treat the prisoners in certain way. The guards were absolutely good people, no criminal background. They were carefully selected. However, the directions that they were given and the environment which was created around them forced them to do evil things to the prisoners, the people who were playing roles of a prisoner. And by the end of the experiment, they had internalized it so much that they were actually proposing as if things which were really, really evil. The idea really was, and the conclusion was, that why do good people, well, a lot of reasonable people, some people who are not good, they can do evil stuff. Why do good people with good backgrounds, with good training, with good ethical kind of upbringing do bad stuff? And I think what Dr. Inayat was referring to it, how we incentivize people, and to the culture that we create, the situations that we create, force people to cross that boundary. And in certain cases, we've seen this in Enron, we've seen this in Tesco's, we've seen this in various kind of examples where the entire system, because of the environment which was created, and what that environment deems as acceptable or not, really forces a peer pressure on people to be able to do things which are unethical. So really, as Ehsan mentioned, Lisa also said, we need to inculcate and drive a culture and live it to be able to drive ethical behaviors.
Thank you, Naved. Sadia?
Thank you, Shoaib. I think you mentioned a number of good examples of what how ethics is defined. But just as a follow-on what Naved just said, brought to mind a quote that I recently came across, that ethics is knowing the difference between what you have the right to do and what is the right thing to do. So you may have the right to do many things, but it is really that decision of how it impacts the stakeholders involved in that decision. Now, as you know, PICG does conduct a number of courses on corporate governance, and really feel that the basic tenets of corporate governance, which is transparency, fairness, accountability, responsibility, these are all the basic tenets of having an ethical behavior in the workplace as well. I just want to quote a small example which I came across yesterday in the workplace. And this is an institution which sort of spreads a good word about corporate governance. So we organize lots of different events, and we usually have a no cash policy when we advertise events and collect fees. But just so happened at a recent event, because there were lots of late registrants and last minute entries, we had to take a number of cash payments. After the event, the finance minister in his wisdom gave the cash payments and the checks to one of the office boys to deposit in the bank. On the way to the bank, chap had a puncture, he went on the shell, lost his envelope, went back to look for it, the cash had disappeared, the checks were there, he came home. So I was asked to deliberate what to do in the situation. When I looked at the amount, a very small amount compared to what we deal with, but it represented 34% over this particular individual's monthly paycheck. Now, the decision is, of course, the bottom line was because it was resources that belonged to the company, it had to be reimbursed because my fiduciary responsibility to the corporation to make sure that nothing gets lost from the company's own accounts. But how to determine whether this individual, if he's correct and honest, do I penalize him over 34% over his monthly salary? Or do I agree that it was an honest mistake, but then set a bad precedence that these things can be overlooked, whether it was negligence or whether it was really conduct. So it was a minor issue compared to the small amount involved, but a very large issue in terms of setting a precedence in a new organization that I had joined. And I believe it took up a number of hours of my thinking time last night to how to deal with it. And I'll let you know the conclusion later on. But what I'm saying is these are just small examples of what you deal with in the workplace. And unless the tone is set from the top, and I model the kind of behavior that I want reflected in the entire organization, I will not have the rest of the organization following those principles and those practices. So that's my 2 cents on stuff.
Very valid point. Thank you.
Thank you. Especially being on a panel discussion, I've been a firm believer it's always better to be first than to be better. Being the last, you're left with very little. In any case, I'm just going to start off with some numbers that probably unethical practices have been responsible for more than 50% of the largest bankruptcy in the last 30 years. Live examples can be your Enron, your Lehman Brothers, your WorldCom. And there is a potential that a further economic toll of almost 1.2 trillion can take place if such kind of unethical practices are repeated according to Human Resource Management Society. So having said that, unethical practices do take a serious financial toll on the organization. So it is kind of like, imperative. I'll give you a classic example as I've just recently gone through it also. Whenever any organization endeavors into investing into digital initiatives, so these are long-term initiatives which would definitely reap results after 4, 5 years, 6 years, may take a little longer in terms of reflecting upon your profitability. Whereas the managers at the helm of the affairs, they would always have a short-term view on any digital initiative. And the reason being that their contract is probably a 2 or 3 year contract of employment. So here arises a conflict of goal, where they are actually more keen and concerned about their own bonuses, which are hinged upon the short-term profitability of the company, and hence arises an ethical dilemma. So since many areas have been touched upon, I'm just going to focus a little on the causes and reasons of ethical dilemma. How do they kind of occur in any organization? So the first that I can think of is whenever there is a difference of interest between the shareholders. Say, for example, a company may be interested in kind of increasing in production without focusing much on the quality of the end product, whereas a customer may still want the quality as per their own specification. One promotion, so one might try to kind of take all the credit of the work the other has done. One just last bit that I would like to emphasize is that any action that is legal should not be misconstrued as ethical also. There is a very common term that we use, and that is called ethical legalism. So one has to understand an action can be legal, but it may not be ethical for an organization. With that, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulaiman. I hope that all of you are actually logged into Slido, and I can see a few questions here. But certainly everyone is welcome to ask more questions. So Sulaiman, since you were complaining you were the last one on the panel, so let's start the Q&A from you. And with respect to, obviously we talked about, Dr. and I talked about the global financial crisis and the mistrust that we have seen in the financial services, especially with respect to the lack of trust and confidence among for broker dealers and the investment managers. So can you tell us some of the steps that you think that we can take in Pakistan's market environment at PSX to improve upon this situation?
Sure. So I'm not a veteran to the Pakistan Stock Exchange. It's been just 1.5 years. So the first issue and the challenge that was table placed, and we did a lot of research on that, was why there is a distrust between the investor fraternity, especially individual investors, and the broker fraternity. So we did an analysis and went back into 10 years history to look at, what has been the cause and what are the symptoms. So on an average, if you have 2 broker default every year, consistently for the last 10 years, that's kind of a non-starter, and hence we see a lot of mistrust. The second identification of this entire research was that what is that goes wrong in terms of apart from defaults and compliances. So we discovered that the biggest challenge is mis-selling and miscommunication. So at most of the time, people who are out there in the brokerage industry or in the investment advisory business who are selling their products are actually not trained on lines in terms of what to sell. In order to kind of make an extra buck or so, they will probably end up selling an equity product to maybe a retired person or something like that, or a retired school teacher. So the second biggest challenge is miscommunication and mis-selling. Now coming to what initiatives have we taken in terms of kind of resolving these issues. So first of all, there's an institution which is Pakistan Market Institution, Pakistan Capital Market Institution. The job is to, when you buy your shares, you buy your securities, move it into your CDC account. Don't expect that securities to be stayed, just don't let it be in the custody of the brokers. So these are few steps, and above all, probably a challenge that Pakistan Stock Exchange has been facing is even a step beyond the broker relationship with investors. That was the trading platform. So the kind of resistance I have faced in my last 6 months is just unbelievable in terms of bringing in a new trading platform, which we are going to acquire from Shenzhen Stock Exchange, which is world's 3rd largest traded value exchange in the world. So of course there were many ethical issues attached to it. From the shareholder side, we have a Chinese percent shareholding with the Chinese who wanted to go for the new trading platform in terms of having the China Connect to get online with Hong Kong Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange. But again, we had directors from the broker side who had certain skepticism in terms of a very robust surveillance system entailing AI and big data into it. So kind of there were serious ethical dilemmas, but I'm really happy that now we have reached a stage that we are moving ahead with the new trading platform. We are doing more trainings to kind of create more awareness on part of the investors to understand what to expect from the broker. Thank you.
Thank you. Sadia, you have a very diverse background working for regulator, for private sector, and now with PICG as well. One of the questions that I would like to ask you is basically about the material non-public information. And unfortunately, in our marketplace, what we have seen is that at times that information is so widely available that you get access to it, even if you are trying to avoid it. Now, my question to you is how should a fund manager or a broker should act in such a situation where he or she has access to some material non-public information and he is in the business of advising his clients. How to react to, how to solve this ethical dilemma?
I think it's not just for fund managers and brokers, it's really the responsibility also of board members who are privy to a lot of information at the board level. And if they themselves are dealing in shares, obviously that information has to be protected and not used either for themselves or for passing on to other individuals as well. It really goes to the heart of what we're talking about, the ethics and how it is imparted to a particular community or individuals responsible for a certain function. And I think in this case, the stock exchange perhaps has a large part to play, and also their regulators. We've seen over time, and as Inayat was saying, that the regulations have become more and more prescriptive over time. And I think that's because we want to narrow the gap between what an individual has the right to do and what is the right thing to do. So in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of sharing of information, in terms of the use of company resources, they've all become pretty prescriptive. You see the code of ethics or the code of conduct of any organization, whether it's 1 page or whether it's 50 pages, it pretty much deals with the same issues that you shall or shall not do to try and reduce as much as possible the gray area that the employee has to work with, short of having an ethics officer interpreting every ambiguous situation. I think it is very much to the individual to be able to come up with that right decision, given the parameters. I think a lot has to do with, as we were discussing earlier, the environment and the society in which we operate, and of course the precedents set by the leaders. Now, in terms of the education and the environment, I think we have a lot to do in the future. Our basic education system, whether it's university, whether colleges, the fraternities from which the brokerage community are emerging, are probably not imparting the level of education or making ethics a part of that education system for these functionaries when they come to that role to be able to effectively decide between right and wrong. The second is leadership. I'm sorry to say, and I'm saying it from Sulaiman, that the biggest brokers in the community are able to get away with a lot of things, despite whatever the regulators may or may not have been able to do. And that itself sends a bad precedence. If so-and-so got away with it, why am I to be? And it's usually the smaller boys who get caught and never the big boys. So if you don't deal with issues of insider trading with the big boys, you're not going to have that level of integrity and the level of compliance that you want to see across the entire industry. And that is where really the leaders of the industry have to play a proactive role in ensuring that they're setting the right precedents for the rest to follow.
Thank you. Naved, coming to you now. One of the biggest challenges that the employers face in our marketplace is about the misuse of company time. So, what would be your comment on, like, obviously in that is a big ethical problem, that obviously the productivity is lower because people are not doing, and normally, especially in the local companies, you have a practice, we don't have any flexi time, we have a 9 to 5 job, or maybe whatever, excuse me, 9 to 6. So the focus mostly is on actually being there at the time, but the productivity may be much lower. How would you suggest one should address this?
Well, from my experience, I think the way that we should approach work is that work is not a place, number one. Work is a verb. And then if you apply appropriate matrices to judge whether work has been done, you would be able to significantly address that. Whether or not an individual spends X number of hours in the office should not be a metric of whether they have used the time appropriately. Especially in global roles, you do not have to be in a particular place to be seen as working. I think it would, but with that comes a lot of responsibility. because you are actually empowering people to be their own judges and use their time appropriately. And then if you are to benefit the company in that period of time, you should really be working for the company and not really wasting your time. So there's a lot of empowerment, but then with that comes a lot of responsibility. But having said that, if you have your matrices defined correctly in terms of what exactly do you want out of that person, what are you judging that individual for, that would really determine how he or she is behaving and how he or she is using their time. Unfortunately, systems which only measure the clock in and clock out times do not really work. You have to internalize the fact that you are at work, and then during these hours you need to think about work and contribute in terms of the output rather than actual number of hours that's been put in.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ehsan just mentions, for example, in Unilever we have a big culture of agile working. We can work from anywhere in the world, and especially with women participation increasing. There are times when they are needed at home, and they have to at the same time be available for work, and we through technology allow them to be able to do that. One, I'll give you my own personal example. Especially in a global role, when I was working in London in global chief accountants department, and I was working on a global project, and then I had a 2-year-old boy we had a first son there, and so naturally there were challenges of really being in a different country while raising a family. And then being in a global role, you do not necessarily have to clock in and clock out into the office. And most of our team was, one of the persons was sitting in Brazil, one was in Luxembourg. Even people in London, they would avoid traveling to office because it would waste 2 hours of their time. So we would most of our work was on phone. So it doesn't matter whether we are, so in the last 1 year, I think most of my time was spent on phone at a home office, so because it worked. So those are the agile pieces of ways of working that we can implement. But then again, as I said, it comes with a lot of responsibility that you have to use these technologies with responsibility.
Thank you, Naved. Ehsan Sahab, this question for you. How do you see conflict of interest from ethical perspective in our culture, and how to educate the stakeholders on conflict of interest?
Can you repeat that again?
How do you see conflict of interest from ethical perspective in our culture, and how to educate the stakeholders on conflict of interest?
Okay, so obviously all of this has to do with education, right? When a new employee comes in, you take him on board. That onboarding experience or the onboarding exercise must take account of giving not only theoretical examples of what is ethical and what is not ethical, what are the boundaries, etc., but also giving practical examples, citing some instances that have happened in the past. I mean, whilst all of us have pretty evolved ethical standards, no doubt there are infringements happening all the time, right? And so this provides a very valuable database to learn from and to share with particularly new employees, but even existing employees. In fact, the role of the ethics officer, in the organizations that have them or maybe contemplating them, would actually become that much stronger if that ethics officer was also able to cite practical examples of past, ideally within your own organization or within the value chain of your own organization, or perhaps even beyond the value chains. So I think it's constant education and sharing of examples, and of course also empowering the individual to be able to deal with them, based again on the past experience.
Thank you, Ehsan sir. Aleem sir, we already talked about the ethical dilemma from the perspective of the stock exchange. Coming back to that topic, from the company's perspective, we have seen that there have been different instances. I would not quote any example, but there have been many instances in the past and the recent past as well, about cooked books of accounts. And certainly when the financial numbers are not correct, they give a wrong signal to the investors. And obviously the companies are responsible. And at the same time, to some extent, I would hold the auditors also accountable for that. So what would be your comment on that? And how can we improve the situation in our context?
I think it's a very broad question and fairly, fairly interesting. It's a real life situation, actually, and it happens. Before I mentioned about the auditors, I have worked for 30 years, like Ehsan, for 2 multinationals. And in multinationals, they transfer people, the head of the company and the CFO, every 3 years. So I have seen many examples that, under pressure to meet the bonus targets, to meet the, and particularly in your last year of your assignment, people have tried to, achieve targets at that level, without, without being really considering the ethical standards that they have themselves set and they are supposed to lead. So I've seen situation, and the companies have, the global companies have had a system where they have caught them, and that is where they have come out with system whereby, I don't know how much it is common, but instead of giving bonuses on a yearly basis, they have introduced the concept of deferred bonus, that they will give you your bonus after 3 years or after 2 years to make sure that subsequent audit, because the newcomer should not complain that, I've got an empty till to buy. So those are the examples. In Pakistan also, I have sat on the board of many leading companies. I'm still on the board of Anglo Corporation, and I'm the chairman of the audit committee. I have always been the chairman of the audit committee of the board in all the listed companies that I have sat. I have come across many examples. I'm not mentioning about Anglo, but I have come across many companies when situation where if the profit is too much, then they want to suppress it by making provisions which are not necessary. And there are situations when the profit is not as much as the target is or as the shareholders expect, then they say, why do we need this provision? Why should we? So, and that's where the test comes, that the auditors, how much in league are the auditors. Good auditors will not allow this to happen, or if at all, they would put up the note, and it's up to the board to basically own this. And I think that is probably one of the reasons that our Code of Corporate Governance has emphasized that the independent director should be heading the audit committee, because that's where the role comes. And again, talking of the multinationals, Ehsan will support me on this, that many companies would not allow the same nationality of CEO and the CFO. They would not. They would make sure that if the national is the CEO, then the CFO should be, so that those ethical controls and all those should not be compromised. So there are checks and balances. This is a real life situation. Even today, I've seen many examples, and ethics is not necessarily the misuse of funds or accruals and profitability. Providing off-spec product, that's unethical, and that happens every day in this country, in Pakistan, in the oil business. That what product that you accept and what you supply, and many companies, not necessarily big names, will not risk those. But as I said at the start, it's your reputation. If you care for your reputation, the good companies, whether national or international, they will never risk these type of things. They will forego their business. So those are living examples. And your question, to wrap up your question on the auditors normally would catch up and would not allow this to happen. But the system is not 100% foolproof.
Yeah, Naved, please.
Aleem sir touched upon the evaluation and targets piece. I probably would want to kind of elaborate on that. And both from an organization's performance evaluation perspective, the manager's performance as an organization, and which determines your bonuses at the end of the day. Also individual people's performance evaluation and how that's structured really makes a difference in the behaviors that they exhibit. If you have a very hard-coded evaluation mechanism where it's all number driven with no context of in the environment in which that performance has been delivered, it would drive behaviors like we talked about, unethical behaviors, both at an individual level as well as, so I'm increasingly seeing that a hard-coded, number-driven evaluation is we're moving away from that. The normal curve evaluation is really being pushed out in the interest of looking at the context in which that performance has been delivered. And in certain cases, even if the number has not been achieved, doesn't mean that the performance is poor. And that would drive really good ethical behaviors at the end of the day.
Thank you. Ehsan sahab, with regard to that's a very interesting question. Do you think that too much emphasis on ethics creates roadblocks to innovation, especially in the context of science and technology?
I've got to think about that. I mean, I can't think of many examples where following an ethical behavior is not good for business. So I'm just struggling with this question. Why would an organization that instills ethical behavior into its core culture would struggle with innovation? Now, unless, of course, you're referring to the generic pharmaceutical industry, where maybe the practice has been to take somebody else's patent and tweak it a little bit and call it your own. And then, of course, the industry grows, and we have a neighboring country where I mean, the generic pharmaceutical industry and the API production has greatly benefited by tweaking the patents and so on and so forth. Now that would have been unethical in the broader context, but they now have actually created that industry, which even the West is now relying upon for the supply of affordable drugs. So can you, in the scheme of things, justify that? Well, it has certainly made drugs more affordable. And otherwise, of course, than otherwise. So in that sense, perhaps, yeah. But if I was a company whose patent was being tweaked in order to get to whatever the ends were, because I think the people who would have tweaked them were not tweaking it with the broader social objective. They were doing it purely for their own self-interest. Yeah. Over a period of time, with further tweaking, etc. They were able to develop an industry. I would certainly not recommend that would be the way forward. But yes, I mean there are examples where innovation has actually benefited by not following an ethical behavior, and that is indeed a dilemma.
Thank you. Sadia, in your current role as the CEO of the PICG, how much focus do you have on ethics in terms of your programs, directors training program, and other events you do?
Shoaib, as I mentioned earlier, we really feel that ethics is integrally connected to corporate governance. The way the program has been designed, initially the directors training program, there was a lot of stuff received from the IFC World Bank on the basis of which we developed our content further. I'm in the process of revamping that, and there are 3 elements that I want coded into every module that we deliver as part of directors training. One is, of course, my pet topic, which is diversity. One is sustainability, and third is ethics. So we're going through, again, the trainers to make sure that all our faculty, whether they're talking about finance or about strategy or about performance evaluation, they keep looking at these 3 elements as well while delivering their particular content. Apart from that, we also have an increasing interest in delivering sessions and seminars just on ethics. In fact, we're already in talks with ACCA to try and combine our efforts there to try and deliver this content to as many corporations as possible. The third element is our in-house corporate advisory, and again, increasing level of interest in us coming in formulating the code of ethics and formulating the ethics policies and other related areas where we can help out as part of our advisory services. So we find that in all areas, whether it's open enrollment, whether it's company-specific, or whether it's in-house corporate advisory, there is a high focus on ethics, and we're doing an increasing amount of delivery on that subject.
Thank you. Sulaiman, why do people take legal ways to do unethical things? especially in the financial sector?
Yeah, so as I had mentioned earlier that probably something can be legal but not ethical. So give you an example, probably there is a defect in a product that is being sold by a manufacturing firm, and what they're doing is actually they're not kind of disclosing that defect. It's not an overt lie, but it's kind of being dishonest in terms of not providing all the information that is required to be known by your buyer. So I think Sadia also mentioned that probably, doing what is right and being right, these are two separate things. We face dilemmas in our organizations where there are positions for chief executives available and there are sitting directors who have applied for it. So again, it's a tricky situation to deal with, whether, you really can apply in that position without, tendering your resignation. How does it kind of provides a level playing field to all the directors to interview while you are there sitting there? So again, it's a very tricky situation where, people, if they want to use it in their own favor, they would probably resort to the legality part of it. If it's not working their way, probably then the ethics comes into play. So it's a little unfortunate, but it's a gray area.
Thank you. Sadia, coming back to you, if you wear your regulator hat back again, regulators in our market has been to kind of over-regulate to ensure ethical behavior. Now, how do you create a right balance between regulation and the development of the markets to ensure that the innovation, again, is not stifled?
Thank you, Shoaib. As I said, it's been a while since I was a regulator, but just going back to those early days, I remember the first few weeks that I was inducted into the organization and the first few show cause notices that we issued to corporations. The directors who were coming in were the peons and the drivers of those corporations who had been asked to be directors on paper and weren't actually, of course. And starting from that level and then working on the code of corporate governance and then seeing the sea change, at least in the thinking and behavior, had been very satisfying to a certain level. And the whole aim in those days was really to strike the balance between the policeman and being a partner in development. And I think we managed to do that a bit in those days, and successive, of course, regimes have tried to do it in their own fashion as well. I have to say I'm sorely disappointed in the most recent evolution of the code, which has just been notified last week, which has really, I think, taken a big step backwards in terms of what we had aimed to do in having a mindset shift in people's attitudes towards the compliance with corporate governance. Most of the provisions have been taken to comply or explain. And you'll appreciate that in our culture and environment, if you're given a choice between comply and explain, you'll explain most of the time, and you'll find a very nice way to explain it through the various ways you can deal with your auditors. I'm disappointed because, one, I don't think that we had reached the level of maturity in our corporate sector, and I don't think we had reached that level of development in our economy to be able to do that right now. I think we had achieved a lot of progress in the past decade and a half in trying to get people to accept various provisions, to become aware of the importance of independence, to become aware of the benefits of instilling good corporate governance, and then to take the step back, I think was not the right and timely thing to do. So striking that balance, as I said, is really depends really on the evolution of the country's economy, on the evolution of the maturity of the corporate sector, and the regulator's role is really to be able to assess which is the right time in this evolution to play more of a development partner role or more of a policeman. And I think all of us struggle with that, but as I said, I am not in agreement with the current situation.
Thank you. Naved, there's a question for you now, and that is about, which is very typical in our marketplace, to hire third-party contract employees. And the question coming from the audience is basically that one of the ethical dilemma or the I would say the objective is basically not to give them the long-term benefits. How do you see this situation, and is it an example of unethical behavior?
Well, it's a See, I mentioned earlier that it's organizations like ours, the larger corporations, who have a big footprint, and they have the muscle to be able to change the paradigm in which we operate. It will. So if you ask me whether it's right or wrong, clearly if you have someone who is on a contract kind of arrangement for a long period, in principle they are your employees, and they should be treated like any other employee. However, the context that it's important that the context that you are operating in, and the competitive space that you are operating in, it is important that the bigger players take the lead and redefine this space. If we don't stick our necks out on any agenda, and then if you look at Unilever globally, some 10 years back when Paul Polman came to helm of things, there's a new agenda around where we said we'll double our business while halving our carbon footprint. We've just announced an agenda around plastics where we are saying that by 2025 we'll be consuming lesser plastic than we'll be throwing out, and we'll be using all recyclables. Organizations like ours, Unilever being a 50 billion euro company, as big as a small economy, we can actually change the way that we operate. And then Paul was really a champion of really social capitalism, if that may be a word, how you can really do good while developing a business and while growing. And if we don't set those standards, the smaller players, the other players in the industry, they can never do that. So it is a tough one, but having said that, the onus is upon organizations, bigger organizations, and joined with regulators really, because if everyone does it, it becomes easier it becomes a level playing field for everyone. If one of the organizations really sticks their neck out and starts doing it, especially if they're small, it becomes difficult for them. So it has to be kind of approached in that manner.
Thank you. Ehsan sir, with regards to, because you have a multinational background, so my question to you is that if you have people coming from different backgrounds, different countries, different skill sets, you have a mix of skilled and unskilled people. So how do you practice a common ethical standard, and what is the best way to do that?
I think from the ground up. So at every level, the code that you adopt, whether you call it code of business practices or whatever you want to call it, it has to be the same, right? It has to be the same at the factory floor. It has to be same at the board level, at the executive level, and so on. So I don't believe that because you have diversity in the makeup of your people, that you need to have different ethical standards. So ethical standards are common. And the job of ensuring that everybody accurately or correctly understands and lives by them is obviously the senior managements. It's the leaders. So at a plant level, it would be the plant managers, but it would be the supply chain directors, and so on. But as I was trying to make the point earlier, the responsibility shouldn't really just stop there. It has to go into the extended value chain. So in your suppliers, in your customers, etc., because even if you behave very ethically within your own organization, if the products and the on which you add value are unethically produced, then at the end of the day, that's going to do your brand harm. So I think it's the same standard, but the responsibility obviously is of the senior management.
Thank you.
Yeah, may I just build up on this? I think we have discussed so far the corporate sector. Corporate sector also includes the government-owned organizations like Pakistani State Oil, PIA. What we have been talking is a piece of cake. I have worked in the government organization for 5 years. I've been the head of Pakistani State Oil. They also talk about ethics. We also talk about ethics, but implementing it in the way that we have just talked about, it is extremely, extremely difficult. And I think we should not lose our sight on this, because they are big corporates. They are listed on the stock exchange. They are subject to same regulations, same standards. But because of the interference or the shareholding, partial shareholding, not necessarily the majority shareholding from the government, there is so much influence that you really have to be tested on a daily basis as to whether it meets your standards or it doesn't meet. I mean, so you have the option to either walk out or comply. And I think those are the conditions where operating. So whatever we have been talking about is very, very simple. I think we have to keep those challenges in mind as well.
Thank you, Aleem Sahab. And I'll ask you a follow-up question on that. Certainly you highlighted one area, which is the public sector. There is another angle to it, that is the social, I would say, I will use the word so-called social welfare sectors. For example, educations, hospitals, where on face of it, there's one can feel like this is basically, the objective is social welfare, but then in our environment, those educational institutions and hospitals, they are really commercial entities. So how do you keep a balance between this commercial objectives and the social welfare in such organizations?
That's a difficult one. I haven't come across a situation like this. I think because in all fairness, I think they do come out as a commercial organization and they have their ethics in terms of performing their duties. I mean, in terms of educating the children, I mean, or if there is an educational institution. But in terms of, if you're talking of the financial side of it, the fees and all those, they have a right to make profit. And as long as it remains reasonable profit, I think people go with the intention that quality never comes cheap. So if they are providing you quality education and providing you at a price which is better than higher than the others, I see no problem. But as long as they are honest in terms of delivering the product that they have promised, in raising the standard, in delivering the quality of comprehensive education, I see no problem.
Any other thoughts on it?
I mean, absolutely agree with that. I think an organization can be a hospital or an education institution, but can be for profit, as long as that's very clearly set out and the principles are, transparent and so on, and the behavior is ethical. I mean, absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to,
sure.
I mean, I don't know whether you're running out of questions or not. Yeah. Just want to say that I just returned from Brussels, and I think some of you would be familiar with the fact that the EU, the European Union, has granted Pakistan what they call the GSP Plus, this General System of Preferences Plus facility, whereby particularly our textile goods, but it's not limited to textile goods, but textiles has been the biggest beneficiary of this. They are able to export free of any import duty there. And every 2 years there's a review. And that review is done in the context, a very broad context, but the broadest or the most prominent aspect of that review is how Pakistan is conforming to the 27 United Nations conventions. And these are to do with human rights and labor and so on. But they also look at how the businesses, particularly the businesses that are benefiting by the GSP Plus, but not limited to that, how the businesses are according by the general standards that they expect you to conform to. So, here's a dilemma. If Pakistan does not conform to the 27 conventions in a meaningful manner, according to the commitments that they made, and they don't expect you, the country, to come up to from 0 to 100 in year one. And this has been going on since, 2014, right? So we've had a number of years of this, and it's going to expire in 2023. So there's one review now, and there's going to be another review before the end of it. So here's a practical example. If you don't conform to this, you would actually lose the ability to export or on a duty-free basis. And if that happens, our exports to EU could come down by $1.5 billion. We're struggling with 21, 22, whatever billion, and losing $2 billion would be the consequence.
Well, there are a lot of more questions, but I've been told that we are running out of time. So if any panel member would like to give a final thoughts, if anybody would like to share. Yeah.
I just would like to wrap up by saying that, it is very important. This subject is very important, and it's a live subject. And I think we should practice it right from the junior level to the senior level. And there are various surveys, international surveys, and even in surveys in Pakistan, which suggest that people don't believe in this. But I think that is that, this is not a one-time exercise. This is a constant exercise, and this should be followed up, because reputation means a lot. It's not your financials only, it's your reputation, and it's not built over 1 year, over 2 years. And I mean, why do young graduates would like to join company X, company Y, and organization A and B, and they don't want to go to other organizations? So I think this is something that people have to keep in mind, and I think the role of the leaders like us is very much there, that we practice and what we preach on this.
Sure. And Aleem sir, just to build on what you said.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
I mean, I saw a banner there. It says, let's put ethics at the heart of everything we do. Let's measure up. I want to focus on the term measure up, right? You only measure up if you know where you were and where you are going to go to, right? So the practice that we've adopted at the Center of Excellence in Responsible Business is that we do a baseline survey before we start any initiative, whether it's on, for example, inclusive growth or responsible practices towards the environment, etc. And rightly, I think we start from the people that are closest to us. So these are predominantly members of the Pakistan Business Council. Yeah. So we ask them what is your level of incorporation, for example, of women at various levels. Yeah. So this is at the beginning of the journey. Then every year thereafter we do the same. So we partner IFC, and we will be partnering other organizations, etc. And that measure then gives you an idea of whether you're making any progress or not. Obviously, we would ideally like to have more people participate in that. But we've started with where it was the easiest. But we would now like to have more organizations participate in measuring up.
Thank you. Sadia, you wanted to add something?
I think it's important to distinguish between ethical dilemmas within the workplace, and those are some of the issues we spoke about today: confidentiality, misuse of resources, etc. But then there's also the ethical dilemmas vis-a-vis the choices that a corporation makes towards the community, towards society. And I think more and more focus needs to be put on that as well. And two reasons. One, of course, the one push is coming from your employee base. The new generation, the millennials, are very much purpose-driven, and they only want to join organization, work for organizations which have that purpose. And the other push is coming from your international investors, and we've seen a lot of them vote with their feet and go away from businesses that were not involved in ethical practices. We had one case where a Finnish company came in with a large investment and realized that there was child labor within that industry, had to scoot very quickly because there was a big fallout politically in their country. But also, I mean, just as a side, when we're talking about sustainability, I mean, having plastic bottles right in front of us does not really augur well. So we all really need to walk the talk and do it in all aspects of our life, not just one of them. I often say in jest, but I mean it seriously, we can't talk about diversity in the workplace and have the men in the organization treat their co-workers with respect, but then just go home and beat up their wives. So really, it's really part of the society and the mindset that we need to change. And as I said, charity begins at home.
Thank you. Sulaiman?
Just last bit, as I've always said, that probably we as a nation, we have just miserably failed in documenting our success stories, right? You have the likes of Cardis and so many success stories in this country. Have we documented those? No. So what are we going to give it to our next generation? Likewise, from this platform, I would strongly suggest that what we do is we start documenting these case studies, because there's nothing legal and illegal about it. It's just about right and wrong. So I think it's high time that, we should have more case studies on these institutions, how they have dealt with a certain situation, which is an ethical dilemma. So maybe we can refer it, the generation can refer it in the days to come. Thank you.
Very quickly, I spent about 3-4 years in London. Now, when I was there, I used to think that why is it that we as a nation can't be as organized and as respecting of the norms and the laws as people over there were. And I'll give an example. I went to attend Wimbledon, and this was a 4-hour line. And even to get into the line, you had to take a ticket. So, and no one would skip the line, the place in the line, not let alone when you get to the entrance gate. No one can dare do that. But even in the line, they would just not do it. And I think the reason is that they are assured that when it's their turn, they will get it. And there's this belief that I do not have to skip the line, because the system works to make sure that when it's your turn, when you are supposed to get something, you will get it. And that's where you institutionalize the ethics in the society, institutionalize obedience of law in the society. And I think that's what they have done better. If we make sure that, and it comes with implementation, make sure that whatever ethical standards, laws that are being promulgated, we need to make sure that they are implemented so that no one has an incentive to skip the line.
Naved, very well point, and in this context I would like to add here that in the marketplace there are certain organizations which feel that it is important for them to stay in the marketplace and they have to be unethical because there are other players who are also unethical. So in order to survive you have to be unethical. That is the mindset people come from. It's always a chicken and egg situation. So we have to start from ourselves. We have to kind of improve ourselves and be ethical. And in that context, Ehsan sir mentioned about let's put ethics at the heart of everything, banner there from CFS Society. So one thing that I would like to share is that until a few years ago, CF Institute, which is a wealth of information and material on ethics training, we used to confine it to ourselves. And our website has got a lot of information, lot of case studies and situations. So obviously only the members of the CFS Society or the CF Institute could get access to that. Now in the last few years, a major change that has come about is that anybody, any of us can go to the website, create an account, generate a username and password, and you can have access to all that information. And from the context of what we are talking about, they have a special section which is called Ethics in Practice. And every week, a new short case, which takes you about 15 minutes to do, to read and answer. So there's a short case of 1 to 2 paragraphs, followed by one question, multiple choice questions. And you can go there, you can log in, and every Monday they put in a new case. And you can actually see how the ethics work in practice. And obviously you can comment on it as well. So like I was looking at the case which was posted 2 days ago on Monday, and there are already 20 comments on it. So you can kind of benefit from the interaction with the global audience. So I would encourage all of you to actually go to the website, log in, create a login, and then access that information. And then there are online ethics programs also. These are more extended programs which take like 1 hour to about 90 minutes to complete. And with this, I would like to conclude this very good interactive session. I apologize that many of the questions from the audience could not be covered due to paucity of time. Thank you very much.